Qu'est-ce qui t'est arrivé à Whitey?
Whitey est mort.
Oui, je sais. Je l'ai vu. Quand je suis sortie, j'ai vu du sang sur ses mains. Une fois dehors, j'ai appelé Whitey, Whitey, Whitey. Mais il n'y avait personne. Personne. J'ai appelé au secours, mais il n'y avait personne.
Elle ment. Elle ment. Elle ne fait que ça. Elle sait ce qu'elle a fait. Elle s'est assurée qu'il allait mourir. Joy est la personne qui a détruit ma vie. C'est la personne qui m'a pris mon père. C'est quelqu'un de vraiment horrible. Elle proférait souvent des menaces et elle harcelait tout le monde. J'avais très peur qu'elle s'en prenne à moi aussi. C'est un sentiment que je ne souhaite à personne. C'est dur.
Quel souvenir gardez-vous de lui?
Son rire.
Vous voulez faire une pause?
C'est la première fois que je donne une interview. Ça fait ressurgir beaucoup de souvenirs que j'avais enfouis et que je préférerais oublier. Je n'aime pas me rappeler à quel point j'ai souffert. J'appréhendais beaucoup de faire cette émission, et mes enfants aussi. J'ai toujours l'impression de devoir rester en alerte, de me demander ce qui va se passer, ce qu'elle va bien pouvoir faire. Surtout si elle sort. Là, je sais qu'elle fera quelque chose. Mais il fallait que quelqu'un prenne la parole pour mon père. Que quelqu'un soit là pour lui. Pour que les gens connaissent la vérité et sachent quel genre de personne elle est. C'est mon père dans son bar. Il avait toujours le sourire. Il était joyeux, plein de vie. Je l'admirais beaucoup. Quand il était plus jeune, il avait les cheveux blancs, alors les gens l'appelaient Whitey. Il avait ouvert un bar, le Whitey's. Quand il arrivait quelque part, les gens étaient contents de le voir. Tout le monde vous le dira. Les gens l'adoraient.
Vous avez du mal à regarder cette photo? Vous regardez souvent des photos de lui? C'est trop dur.
Tous les week-ends, toutes les vacances scolaires, et dès que j'avais un moment, j'étais avec mon père. Il était aussi entraîneur de basket.
À toi maintenant.
Il dégageait du temps pour s'entraîner avec nous. Il adorait ça. Il a toujours été très présent.
Waouh, joli panier. Attends, recommence.
Il me disait rarement non. Il n'aurait peut-être pas dû, mais il faisait tout pour moi. Il s'est toujours assuré que je ne manque de rien. J'avais 9 ans quand mon père m'a présenté Joy. Ils avaient l'air de bien s'entendre au début. Puis ça s'est dégradé très rapidement. Mon père et Joy passaient beaucoup de temps ensemble. C'est allé très vite. Ils avaient l'air heureux. Ça avait l'air de bien se passer au début. Ce qui les rapprochait, c'est qu'ils tenaient tous les deux un bar. La première fois qu'elle est venue au Whitey's, elle l'a vu et elle s'est dit qu'elle l'aurait. C'est ce qu'on m'a raconté. Quand je l'ai rencontrée, je l'ai trouvée grande, dynamique, bruyante et pas très subtile.
Ton père m'a dit que tu étais une bonne basketteuse?
Moi, je suis plutôt réservée. Je n'aimais pas trop être dérangée. Et elle était très insistante avec moi. Elle me posait beaucoup de questions.
C'est super! Il faudra que je vienne te voir jouer.
Il y avait quelque chose chez elle qui ne me plaisait pas. Elle en faisait des tonnes pour que je l'apprécie et pour se faire aimer. C'était bizarre, ça ne collait pas. Comme si elle tenait trop à faire bonne impression. C'est Joy et mon père lors de leur croisière. Ils venaient juste de se marier. C'est l'une des plus grosses erreurs de sa vie. Tout s'est effondré après ça. Après le mariage, on a découvert une nouvelle facette de sa personnalité. Comme si elle faisait semblant depuis le début. Quand mon père avait le dos tourné, ce n'était plus la même. Elle voulait tout contrôler. Elle ne supportait pas qu'on soit tous les deux.
Ça va être comme ça tous les week-ends?
Elle ne supportait pas qu'il soit avec quelqu'un d'autre qu'elle.
Je veux passer du temps avec mon mari.
Il fallait qu'elle soit au centre de l'attention. Elle voulait toute l'attention pour elle. Elle voulait mon père rien que pour elle. Je sentais qu'elle ne voulait pas que je vienne toutes les semaines. Elle aurait voulu plus de liberté le week-end.
On peut prendre une babysitter. C'est juste une soirée.
Quand elle proposait de sortir ou d'aller au bar, il lui disait « J'ai ma fille ce week-end, on ne peut pas sortir. Je ne peux pas la laisser seule, je reste avec elle. »
Pas ce soir.
Ça se voyait sur son visage qu'elle était en colère. Elle ne disait plus rien. On savait qu'elle n'était pas contente. Elle ne disait plus un mot. Elle me fixait du regard avec des yeux pleins de haine. Mon père ne voyait pas cet aspect-là au début. Un jour, je suis sortie manger avec Joy. On a croisé quelqu'un. Je ne sais pas si cette personne l'a mal regardée, mais elle l'a prise à partie.
C'est quoi votre problème?
Elle lui hurlait dessus. Moi, je disais rien.
Regardez où vous allez, vous auriez pu me tuer.
Je suis restée sans voix. Pourquoi s'énervait-elle comme ça? Ça a duré longtemps. Au bout d'un moment, j'ai failli rentrer retrouver mon père.
Ne m'ignorez pas, revenez.
C'était effrayant. Je comprenais pas pourquoi elle réagissait comme ça. Après cet incident, si elle était énervée, je restais à distance. Il valait mieux que je reste loin d'elle, à l'abri. Un jour, j'étais dans le salon. Je regardais des dessins animés et j'ai remarqué qu'il y avait des armes sur le canapé et sur le fauteuil. C'était la première fois que je les voyais. C'était nouveau. Ensuite, j'en ai vu sous les meubles, sur les tables, sur les coussins, partout. Dans la cuisine. Il y en avait partout dans la maison. Elles étaient posées par terre ou contre le mur. Ce n'était pas comme lorsque des fusils de chasse sont souclés dans une vitrine. Il y avait des pistolets et d'autres armes un peu partout. Et il y en avait plusieurs dans la chambre. Je me demandais ce que ces armes faisaient là. Il y en avait partout dans la maison. Ce n'était pas anodin. Je savais que ce n'était pas normal. Je n'ai pas dit à ma mère qu'il y avait des armes chez mon père. Sinon, elle ne m'aurait pas laissé y retourner. Elle aurait voulu me protéger. À l'époque, je ne savais pas ce qu'il faisait. Mais plus tard, j'ai eu confirmation que mon père et Joy étaient impliqués dans du trafic de drogue. Joy avait une vie beaucoup plus dangereuse que ce qu'on imaginait. Et quand ils se sont mis ensemble, mon père s'est retrouvé impliqué lui aussi. Je ne voulais plus rester seule avec elle, après toutes ces disputes. J'avais peur d'être avec elle. Au début, quand mon père et Joy se sont mis ensemble, tout allait bien. Mais ça n'a pas duré.
Qu'est-ce que tu crois?
Un jour, mon oncle a eu une discussion très sérieuse avec mon père. On voyait qu'il parlait de quelque chose de grave.
Elle a un problème. Tu ne la connais pas.
Mon oncle a dit à mon père qu'il devait se méfier de Joy, que ce n'était pas quelqu'un de bien, et qu'elle finirait par lui causer du tort. Ça m'a fait du bien de savoir que quelqu'un d'autre était conscient qu'il y avait un problème. Ça faisait longtemps que je m'inquiétais pour lui. Je pensais qu'il finirait par ouvrir les yeux et s'éloigner d'elle.
Ne me dis pas que je t'avais pas prévenu.
Si seulement il avait écouté les gens qui lui ont dit de se méfier d'elle. Avec le recul, je regrette de ne lui avoir rien dit. Je voulais qu'il soit heureux, mais j'aurais dû lui expliquer ce que je ressentais. Si je n'ai rien dit à mon père, c'est parce que j'avais peur d'elle.
Est-ce que Whitey vous a déjà frappé devant ces gens?
Oui, mais je ne veux pas en parler.
Donnez-moi un exemple de ce qu'il a fait.
Il était de mauvaise humeur quand il buvait. Quand il venait me chercher, par exemple, il était en colère. Il disait qu'il ne voulait pas que je sorte avec eux.
Elle dit que mon père la frappait. Je ne l'ai jamais vue lever la main sur elle. Elle est incapable de donner un exemple. Elle essaie d'en inventer, mais personne n'a jamais vu mon père lever la main sur elle, parce que ce n'est jamais arrivé. Ce qu'elle dit décrit plus sa personnalité à elle que celle de mon père. Je ne l'ai jamais entendu élever la voix avec elle. Il essayait plutôt de la faire taire. Et s'il n'y arrivait pas, il s'en allait. Je n'ai jamais vu mon père lever la main sur qui que ce soit, et encore moins sur elle. Même quand elle s'en est prise à moi, il ne l'a pas touchée. Je n'en reviens pas qu'elle lui donne le mauvais rôle. En fait, c'est elle qu'elle décrit. Tous ceux qui connaissaient mon père savent qu'il n'était pas comme ça. C'était de pire en pire entre eux. Leur dispute était interminable. Elle lui hurlait dessus sans arrêt.
Et moi alors? Et mes envies à moi?
Calme-toi.
Ne me dis pas de me calmer.
J'ai compris que ce n'était pas un environnement normal. Avec toutes ces disputes et ces manipulations, il n'y avait rien dans leur vie qui était normal.
Il faut toujours que tu sois le héros.
Ils ne voulaient pas que je les voie se disputer. Ils ne voulaient pas que je sache qu'ils avaient des problèmes.
Pas devant elle.
La première fois que je l'ai vue être violente, mon père allait aider ma grand-mère chez elle. Joy n'aimait pas qu'il y aille. Elle était en colère, alors elle s'en est prise à lui.
Tu n'iras nulle part.
Elle lui a arraché sa chemise.
Non!
Lâche-moi!
Elle ne supportait pas de ne pas être au centre de tout. Elle voulait absolument qu'il soit à ses côtés à tout moment. J'ai vu qu'il était déstabilisé et qu'il était en colère. J'ai vu sur le visage de mon père qu'il n'était pas content et que les choses avaient changé pour lui. Ça m'a rendu triste. Je n'aimais pas le voir malheureux. Tout ce que je ressentais, je le gardais pour moi. Je ne voulais pas en parler. Je voulais continuer de le voir tous les week-ends. Je me disais que si je gardais ça pour moi, ça finirait par s'arranger. J'étais dans le salon de ma grand-mère. Mon père était au téléphone et je me souviens qu'il avait enlevé sa chemise. Elle n'arrêtait pas de l'appeler.
Il faut que tu arrêtes.
Mais elle a continué. Elle appelait sans cesse. Mon père était à bout.
Arrête d'appeler.
Elle n'a pas arrêté. Il essayait de la raisonner pour qu'elle arrête de crier, mais ça ne faisait qu'empirer. Au bout d'un moment, il a arrêté de répondre. Elle devait être très énervée parce que ça n'arrêtait pas de sonner, jusqu'à ce qu'il décroche le téléphone. Je n'avais jamais vu ça. Ma grand-mère non plus. Cette situation affectait ses frères, sa mère, ses amis. Elle a détruit ma famille. Je me suis souvent demandé ce que mon père lui trouvait. Elle avait une mauvaise influence sur lui. Sa vie a complètement changé quand il l'a rencontrée. Avant d'être avec Joy, il fréquentait le même groupe d'amis depuis que j'étais petite. Je les voyais régulièrement. J'ai commencé à me dire que c'était peut-être plus dangereux que ce que je pensais. Quand j'ai commencé à voir les armes un peu partout et à voir des gens que je n'avais jamais vus avant, je me suis inquiétée. On n'était plus en sécurité. Les armes étaient posées par terre ou contre le mur. Il y en avait plusieurs. Je n'avais pas le droit d'aller dans la pièce du fond parce qu'il y en avait partout. Et ils en avaient toujours une près de leur lit. J'avais l'impression qu'il avait peur que quelqu'un débarque en pleine nuit pour s'en prendre à eux. Un jour, j'étais chez mon père et Joy. Il était tard. Quelqu'un a frappé à la porte. Je me suis réveillée à cause du vacarme au rez-de-chaussée. Il se passait quelque chose.
C'était quoi ça?
Je ne sais pas.
J'ai descendu les escaliers et je leur ai demandé ce qui se passait. Ils m'ont dit de retourner me coucher et que ce n'était rien. Je savais qu'il y avait quelque chose, mais je ne savais pas quoi. Je suis retournée dans ma chambre et j'y suis restée. J'ai eu très peur cette nuit-là. J'étais terrifiée. J'ai compris plus tard, quand j'ai posé des questions, que quelqu'un avait frappé à la porte et que la personne était partie en les voyant arriver. Je me demande si cette personne était venue pour lui faire du mal. Peut-être qu'elle a vu qu'il n'était pas seul dans la maison, ou peut-être qu'elle a eu peur et qu'elle s'est enfuie. J'ai toujours pensé que Joy avait prévu de tuer mon père ce soir-là.
Apparemment, c'est arrivé quand il a ouvert la porte.
Alors il l'attendait.
C'est possible. C'est ce qu'on vérifie.
C'est certain. Vous savez, tout le monde le déteste.
Pardon?
Tout le monde le déteste.
Dans cette vidéo, elle dit que tout le monde détestait mon père. C'est complètement faux. C'était l'inverse. Tout le monde l'adorait et personne ne savait pourquoi il l'avait épousé. Les gens racontent que quand il jouait au billard, il payait des tournées à tout le monde. Il ne s'est jamais disputé avec personne, à part avec elle. Elle a dit ça pour qu'on pense qu'il avait des ennemis et que quelqu'un aurait voulu le tuer. Elle voulait se disculper. Ça montre le genre de personne qu'elle était. Un jour, ils se sont disputés très fort. Je ne sais pas ce qui avait déclenché cette dispute, mais je me souviens qu'elle hurlait et qu'elle avait l'air très énervée.
Reviens ici! Qu'est-ce que tu fais?
Elle était vraiment folle de rage.
Ne pars pas quand je te parle!
La voiture ne voulait pas démarrer. Quand mon père avait rouillé les portières, elle a pris un morceau de bois et elle s'est mise à frapper les vitres pour les casser. Elle tapait sur la voiture comme une folle.
Ouvre cette porte!
Je me suis penchée vers mon père parce que j'avais peur qu'elle casse la vitre. Mon père m'a prise dans ses bras pour me ramener vers lui.
Allez!
J'avais peur qu'elle parvienne à entrer et qu'elle s'en prenne à moi. J'avais envie qu'elle arrête de crier et qu'elle arrête de taper. Je ne savais pas ce qu'elle comptait faire une fois dans la voiture. Je me souviens de ses cris et de la haine dans ses yeux. Elle avait un regard noir. Mon père avait peur. Je voyais qu'il était impuissant. Elle faisait le tour de la voiture et frappait de partout. Il a fini par sortir.
Allez, Whitey!
Elle s'est penchée pour récupérer les clés.
Donne-moi les clés, Whitey!
J'ai attrapé les clés, je ne voulais pas les lui donner.
Ça suffit!
Je ne voulais pas qu'elle s'approche.
Lâche-moi!
J'avais peur. Elle me terrifiait.
Et ensuite, quand est-ce que vous avez de nouveau entendu parler de menaces?
C'était à Noël.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle vous a dit?
Que mon père allait se faire tuer, quelque chose comme ça.
C'est moi qui réponds aux enquêteurs. Je devais avoir 11 ans.
Ça fait quoi d'entendre ça?
C'est dur. Mais je ne me souviens pas vraiment qu'on m'ait posé cette question. J'ai l'air d'avoir peur. Ça montre l'étendue de sa folie. Elle ne se souciait que d'elle-même. S'en prendre à une enfant, lui crier dessus, ça ne lui faisait rien. Elle avait de sérieux problèmes. Je devrais avoir de beaux souvenirs de Noël avec lui, mais je n'en ai pas. Je me souviens que j'étais dans le salon de ma grand-mère et qu'elle n'arrêtait pas de le harceler au téléphone. Les menaces s'intensifiaient. Ça n'arrêtait pas.
Allô?
Elle m'a dit qu'elle ferait tuer mon père.
Dis à ton père que c'est un homme mort.
J'ai eu très peur à ce moment-là. J'étais terrifiée. J'ai raccroché. Aucun enfant ne devrait vivre ça le soir de Noël. Il devait se dire que sa femme ne le ferait pas tuer et que c'était des menaces proférées sous le coup de la colère. En janvier 1997, ils s'entendaient bien. Les choses semblaient s'être arrangées entre eux. Ils faisaient des efforts. Elle était plus détendue, lui était plus heureux. C'était agréable de ne pas les entendre se disputer. Ils cherchaient à acheter une maison pour se rapprocher des bars. Joy me montrait une maison. Elle m'expliquait où serait ma chambre. Ils avaient décidé de l'acheter. Et ils avaient l'air contents ce jour-là. J'étais contente moi aussi. La maison serait plus près de tout. De tout ce dont on avait besoin. Ce dimanche soir, je lui ai dit je t'aime, on se voit demain au basket. Il était vraiment heureux. Il riait. Tout était normal. Avec le recul, je pense qu'elle a fait semblant ce jour-là. Tout était faux. Je crois qu'elle savait qu'il allait se passer quelque chose, que c'était pour bientôt. Mon père me disait toujours, s'il m'arrive quelque chose, souviens-toi que je t'aime. Je m'en souviens très bien. Je me demandais pourquoi il me disait ça. Pourquoi il avait besoin de me le dire. J'ai une famille aujourd'hui. Il devrait être là pour les voir. Je regrette de ne pas avoir dit à mon père ce que je pensais d'elle. Ça lui aurait peut-être permis d'ouvrir les yeux. Le lendemain matin, je suis allée à l'école. Ma grand-mère habitait juste à côté. Je voyais sa maison depuis l'école. J'ai regardé si mon père était chez elle parce qu'il passait souvent la voir. Mais sa voiture n'était pas là. Quelques minutes plus tard, on est venu me chercher. Ma grand-mère est venue me récupérer. J'ai vu qu'elle pleurait. Je suis désolée. Elle m'a dit qu'il avait été tué. J'ai crié. J'ai demandé si c'était elle. Et après, je ne me souviens plus de rien.
Que saviez-vous de ce qui était arrivé à votre père?
Il avait été tué dans le bar de Joy. Je voulais savoir qui avait fait ça. Je voulais qu'ils arrêtent le coupable. Ils m'ont dit que c'était fait.
Que faisait-il des recettes du bar? Il les gardait avec lui?
Oui, il déposait la recette du week-end le lundi.
Et il la mettait où?
Dans la poche de sa veste.
Il y avait combien en général?
On avait tous les deux entre 1000 et 2000 dollars sur nous. Parce qu'on allait souvent faire libérer des gens qui avaient été arrêtés pour conduite en état d'ivresse.
Joy explique que mon père avait souvent de l'argent sur lui parce qu'il allait faire sortir des gens de prison qui avaient été arrêtés pour conduite en état d'ivresse. Je n'ai jamais entendu mon père parler de ça.
Vous n'avez pas l'air d'y croire.
Non. Quand ils ont arrêté Carl, il avait le portefeuille de mon père.
Un portefeuille qui doit appartenir à la victime, Donald Ray Hoop.
Mon père avait souvent de grosses sommes d'argent sur lui. Quand il se préparait le matin, je voyais son portefeuille sur la table. Il y avait souvent beaucoup d'argent à l'intérieur. Ils avaient souvent de l'argent sur eux parce qu'ils trempaient dans la drogue. Je ne le savais pas à l'époque, mais quelques années plus tard, j'ai compris pourquoi il avait toujours autant de liquide sur lui. Quand j'étais plus jeune, je ne voyais pas le problème à avoir autant d'argent sur soi. Par la suite, j'ai compris que ce n'était pas normal. Je savais que ça cachait quelque chose. J'imagine que c'est Carl. Je ne me souviens pas bien de lui. C'était il y a longtemps.
C'est la photo d'arrestation de Carl en 1997.
Il a un sourire en coin et un air satisfait, comme s'il était content de lui. Je n'avais jamais entendu parler de Carl Lindsay avant ça. Carl Lindsay m'a enlevé la personne que j'aimais le plus au monde. Il m'a privé de mon père. Il a brisé ma vie. Il l'a tué de la pire des manières. Sans l'ombre d'un remords. La première fois que j'ai revu Joy, c'était lors de la veillée. Je savais que quelque chose n'allait pas. Lors de la veillée funèbre de mon père, le cercueil était fermé. Personne ne pouvait le voir. Elle déambulait dans la maison funéraire et elle discutait avec tout le monde, comme si c'était la maîtresse de maison. Ce n'était pas normal. Elle rigolait aux obsèques de son mari comme si tout allait bien. Elle n'est même pas restée près du cercueil. Elle n'arrêtait pas d'aller et venir. Pendant ce temps, moi, j'étais en pleurs et je me demandais pourquoi elle avait l'air si heureuse et pourquoi elle ne pleurait pas. Je comprenais pas comment elle pouvait se comporter comme ça alors qu'elle venait de perdre son mari. J'étais persuadée qu'elle y était pour quelque chose. Sinon, pourquoi se serait-elle comportée comme ça lors de l'enterrement de son mari? Joy était particulièrement gentille. C'était bizarre. Pourquoi était-elle aussi gentille avec moi? Je faisais semblant d'être agréable avec Joy parce qu'elle me faisait peur. J'avais peur qu'elle s'en prenne à moi aussi. Elle devait se dire qu'en ayant l'air gentille avec moi, elle passerait pour quelqu'un de bien. Elle faisait semblant d'être gentille pour que je continue de croire qu'elle était innocente. Elle est venue me voir lors d'un match de basket. Elle est restée dans son coin. Elle n'a pas dit grand-chose. Mais après le match, elle est venue me parler à l'extérieur.
Bonsoir. Je peux te parler une seconde?
Je ne comprenais pas ce qu'elle faisait là. Elle n'était jamais venue avant. Elle avait l'air stressée en me parlant. Elle n'était pas à l'aise. Elle m'a dit qu'elle n'aurait jamais fait de mal à mon père.
Tu sais que j'aimais ton père.
Elle m'a demandé si je la pensais capable de lui faire du mal.
Je n'aurais pas pu lui faire de mal.
Elle scrutait mes réactions. Elle me posait plein de questions. Je sentais qu'elle voulait me soutirer des informations. Mais je ne comprenais pas pourquoi elle voulait savoir ça. Elle a insisté sur le fait qu'elle ne lui aurait jamais rien fait de mal.
D'accord?
C'était un moment très tendu. Elle était très sérieuse. Elle voulait que je comprenne. Moi, je ne faisais qu'acquiescer pour qu'elle arrête et qu'elle ne se doute de rien. Je crois qu'à ce moment-là, elle ne se doutait pas que j'avais des soupçons. Elle était prête à tout pour que personne ne croie qu'elle était impliquée.
Bon. Parfait. Parfait.
Elle jouait la comédie pour que je la croie innocente. Mais je savais qu'elle était responsable. Quand j'ai appris qu'elle avait été arrêtée, je me suis sentie soulagée. J'espérais que quelque chose soit fait. J'avais besoin de savoir quelle avait été son implication et de connaître un maximum de détails pour pouvoir comprendre ce qui s'était passé ce soir-là. C'était mon père. Il n'était pas méchant avec elle. Quelle raison pouvait-elle avoir de lui faire ça?
Ce que je veux savoir, c'est de quoi vous avez parlé ce soir-là. Pourquoi avoir mis cette idée dans la tête de Carl?
On n'a jamais parlé du fait de tuer Whitey. Mais j'étais très en colère. Et j'ai dit que j'avais envie de le tuer. C'était pour rigoler. J'insiste sur le fait que c'était une blague. Je lui ai dit, tu pourrais le faire pour moi? Est-ce que je lui ai dit, Carl, on devrait aller tuer Whitey? Non. Non, je ne voulais pas le tuer. Est-ce que je pensais qu'il allait se faire tuer? Non. Maintenant, quand les gens disent des choses en rigolant, je leur dis que c'est pas drôle. Que ça peut être mal interprété et que ça peut mal finir. C'est ce qui s'est passé avec cette discussion ce soir-là.
Elle dit qu'elle plaisantait. Je sais qu'elle ne plaisantait pas. Elle ne dit pas la vérité sur ce qui s'est vraiment passé. Je crois que ça faisait longtemps qu'elle voulait qu'il meure.
D'après vous, pourquoi Joy aurait-elle fait ça?
Ils se sont disputés et sa colère l'a emporté. Elle pensait faire passer ça pour un vol à la tire parce qu'il avait beaucoup d'argent sur lui. Elle s'est dit qu'on ne l'accuserait jamais d'avoir voulu tuer mon père. Joy a piégé à la fois mon père et Carl. Elle voulait que Carl ait une bonne raison de tuer mon père. Alors elle lui a dit qu'il avait de l'argent dans son portefeuille. Et de cette façon, elle se couvrait et ne risquait pas d'être inquiétée. La seule chose qu'elle lui a promise, c'est l'argent que mon père avait sur lui. Au cours du procès, ils ont expliqué que Joy avait appelé le bar de mon père plusieurs fois pour lui demander de venir la chercher. Ils s'étaient disputés. Elle voulait qu'il se dépêche de venir la retrouver. Mon père s'est garé devant le bar et Joy et Carl l'attendaient sur le parking. Carl m'a expliqué tout ce qui s'était passé ce soir-là. Il a tiré une première fois. Mon père est sorti, ils se sont battus. Mon père est tombé par terre. Une fois mon père à terre, l'arme s'est enrayée. Il est entré dans le bar. Quand il a passé la porte, elle était là. Elle lui a débloqué l'arme. Puis Carl est allé lui tirer dessus une deuxième fois. Je me souviens du jour où on m'a appelé pour me dire qu'il avait été condamné à mort. Ça a été un soulagement. Carl a dit qu'il avait bu et qu'il avait pris de la drogue ce soir-là, et que s'il avait été sobre, il ne l'aurait pas fait. Carl est un pantin qui s'est fait manipuler. Mais ça ne dispense pas de la peine capitale. Il l'a tué. C'est lui qui a tiré. Elle s'est servie de Carl pour arriver à ses fins. Et elle pensait s'en sortir comme ça. Lorsque je suis allée voir Carl, je lui ai demandé de me raconter ce qui s'était passé ce soir-là. J'avais l'impression qu'il ne me disait pas tout. Quand je lui posais des questions, il hésitait avant de me répondre. Je sentais qu'il gardait certains éléments pour lui. Et je n'ai jamais obtenu toutes les réponses que j'espérais. J'avais besoin de ces réponses pour faire mon deuil. Mais je ne les ai jamais obtenues, ni de lui, ni de Joy. Aucun d'eux ne me répondait jamais clairement. Et ils n'avaient pas exactement la même version des faits. Pour moi, elle est tout aussi responsable que lui. Parce que c'est elle qui voulait qu'il meure ce soir-là. Et sans elle, il serait encore là aujourd'hui. Je ne sais pas pourquoi Carl la protège. Je me suis toujours posé la question. C'est à cause d'elle s'il est dans le couloir de la mort. C'est elle qui est à l'origine de ce drame. Pendant le procès, on aurait dit que Carl ne ressentait aucune émotion. Il regardait droit devant lui. Et même quand il est passé à côté de nous, la famille, il n'a montré aucune émotion. Il se contentait de regarder tout droit. J'étais en colère. Je me disais qu'il aurait dû montrer quelque chose s'il était désolé. Le sentiment qui dominait chez moi et mes proches, après toutes ces années, c'est qu'on ne se remettrait jamais de la douleur qu'on a ressentie ce jour-là. Joy a été condamnée à la prison à perpétuité avec une période de sûreté de 25 ans. Je trouve ça injuste. Elle devrait passer le reste de ses jours en prison sans avoir la possibilité d'être libérée. Joy est tout aussi coupable que Carl. Je crois que Joy pensait qu'ils pourraient tous les deux s'en sortir sans être inquiétés avec ce scénario. Elle pensait que personne n'irait chercher plus loin qu'une histoire de vol. Quand j'ai demandé à Joy pourquoi elle avait fait ça, elle m'a dit que ce n'était pas prémédité, qu'elle ne voulait pas qu'il meure, que la situation lui avait échappé, que ce n'était pas ce qu'elle avait prévu. Je voulais qu'elle me dise qu'elle était désolée, qu'elle assume ses responsabilités, mais elle ne l'a pas fait. Elle n'a jamais dit qu'elle était désolée. Elle ne le fera sûrement jamais.
D'après vous, pourquoi a-t-elle accepté de vous voir?
Elle voulait me convaincre de son innocence et de la culpabilité de Carl. Je ne croirai jamais qu'elle est innocente. J'ai dit à Joy que je ne lui pardonnais pas ce qui s'était passé, que je ne comprenais pas comment elle avait pu tuer quelqu'un qui faisait tout pour les autres, y compris pour elle, qu'elle avait détruit ma famille et qu'elle avait gâché ma vie. Quand je suis sortie de la pièce, je me suis sentie plus légère d'avoir pu lui dire ce que je ressentais. Joy et Carl m'ont tout pris. Et pas seulement à moi, mais aussi à ma famille. Mon père a raté tous les grands événements de ma vie. Il a raté tous ceux de la vie de mon frère. Il a tout raté. Il n'est même plus là quand on a juste besoin de quelqu'un à qui parler ou qu'on a envie de le voir. Je veux continuer d'honorer sa mémoire. Je veux qu'on sache qu'il n'était pas méchant avec elle, contrairement à ce qu'elle dit. C'était la personne la plus aimante qui soit. Il aidait tout le monde. Pour moi, elle devrait finir ses jours en prison. La justice ne sera rendue que quand elle aura perdu toute possibilité d'être libérée. Parce qu'elle est tout aussi coupable que Carl. Un jour, elle risque de sortir et je pourrai la croiser. Ça me terrifie de penser que je pourrais la revoir. À cause d'elle, depuis que j'ai 10 ans, je n'ai jamais été tranquille. Elle m'a pris mon père. Elle n'admettra jamais ses torts. Ça montre bien qui elle est. C'est une personne malveillante.
The phone rang just after midnight, a shrill, insistent sound cutting through the quiet of a small Illinois town that had already gone to sleep, and when the receiver was lifted on the other end, there was nothing at first but breathing, slow and deliberate, before a voice finally spoke a single sentence that would not be understood for another 34 years. A sentence that sounded meaningless in 1989 and deadly clear decades later. A sentence that would reopen a cold case and drag a Burier name back into the light. Illinois, late summer, 1989. The air is thick, heavy with heat that refuses to break even after sunset. Streetlight Cicadas scream from the trees. A quiet neighborhood sits in the dark, unaware that one house, just like the others, is about to become a crime scene. The front door is unlocked. There are no signs of forced entry. Inside, a television hums to itself, casting a blue glow across an empty living room. In the kitchen, a chair is slightly out of place. On the floor, near the back hallway, lies a body. The shock comes fast. Too fast. A neighbor, checking in after unanswered calls, steps inside and freezes. The scream that follows pulls the entire block out of sleep. Police arrive within minute. Red and blue lights cut through the night. Radio crackle. Flashlights sweep across walls, floors, faces. The victim is identified quickly, a local woman in her early 30s, well-known, well-liked, a familiar face at the grocery store, the post office, the elementary school where she volunteered. There is no weapon at the scene. No obvious struggle. No shatter de glace. Just silence, broken by the measured voices of officers trying to understand what they are seeing. Cause of death is violent. Précise. Personnel. The kind of violence that suggests anger, or fear, or something closer. By morning, the town is wide awake. Word spreads fast. A murder. Here. In this place where nothing est verapant. Front porches fill with whispers. Curtin twitch. People replay their last conversations with the victim, searching for something they missed. The headline hit before noon. Illinois woman found dead in home. Then the word that changes everything. Homicide. By the end of the day, another phrase joins it, heavy and ominous. Cold case in the making. Detectives move through the house inch by inch. Photographs. Measurements. Evidence bags filling slowly, methodically. Fibers. Fingerprint. A partial shoe impression near the back door. A phone message machine with a tape still inside. They rewind it. Static. Clicks. Then voices. Friends. Family. Normal life, preserved in magnetic tape. And then, at the end, something different. A call with no name. No number. Just breathing. And a sentence that makes no sense. Not yet. They canvass the neighborhood. Knock on doors. Ask the same questions again and again. Did you hear anything? See anyone unusual? A car you didn't recognize? Most answers are no. One neighbor mentions a vehicle parked briefly down the street earlier that evening. Another remembers footsteps, maybe, but can't be sure. Memory is already blurring, already unreliable. Time is the enemy, and time has just started running. The investigation surges forward with urgency. Friends are interviewed. Co-workers. Former partners. Anyone who might have had a reason. Alibis are checked. Stories cross-checked. Tensions rise as the circle tightens and then loosens again, leads collapsing under scrutiny. The phone message is logged, tagged, and filed. The partial print is run through databases that, in 1989, are painfully limited. No match. The fibers are inconclusive. The shoe impression fits thousands of soles sold across the Midwest. Nothing speak. Nothing confess. Days turn into weeks. Weeks into months. The headline shrank. The town exhales, but never fully. Fear linger in small way. Doors are locked more carefully. Children are walked to school. Night feel différent now, évier, closer. Detective refuse to let go. They chase tips that go nowhere. They interview the same people twice, 3 times, hoping time will loosen something. But the case resists. It hardens. The word unsolved creeps into internal memos. Then into public language. Then into history. Years pass. The house is sold. Painted. Lived in by someone new who does not know, or pretends not to know, what happened there. The victim's family marks birthdays without her. Holidays with an empty chair. Every knock on the door sends a small jolt of hope, quickly fading. The evidence is boxed, sealed, labeled, and pushed into a locker among hundreds of others, each one a story waiting, each one slowly gathering dust. The town changes. Stores close. New ones open. Kids grow up and leave. Some come back. The murder becomes a reference point, a story told in lowered voices to newcomers, a warning, a memory without an ending. They never caught anyone, people say. It's still a cold case. The phrase settles in, official and final sounding, as if cold means dead forever. Inside the police department, the case survives in fragments. A detective who worked it retires. Another transfers. Files are handed down, summarized, compressed. The original urgency fades, replaced by routine, by new crimes demanding attention. And yet, every so often, someone opens the box again. Reads the reports. Listen to stop. That sentence. Still in English. Still wrong. Still waiting. Then technology begins to change the rules. Databases expand. Old evidence starts to speak in new ways. Across the country, cold cases are being reopened, names pulled from obscurity by advances no one imagined in 1989. In Illinois, a younger detective, not even born when the murder happened, stumbles across the file while reorganizing storage. He listens to the tape. He pauses it, rewinds, plays it again. Something about the voice bothers him. Not what it says, but how it says it. The rhythm. The confidence. The way it assumes it will not be understood. He brings it to his supervisor. Then to another detective. They listen together, silent. The sentence is transcribed again, letter by letter. Someone suggests it might be a reference. An inside joke. A phrase only one person would recognize. The idea hangs in the air. Dangerous. Promising. The box comes out of the locker. Old witness lists are pulled. Names that haven't been spoken in decades are read aloud. Some are crossed out, deceased. Others are living quiet lives, believing they were never suspects, or that suspicion died long ago. The phone records from that night are limited, but not useless. A technician re-examines them with modern tools. A partial trace emerges. Not enough for an arrest. Enough for a direction. The town doesn't know yet. The family doesn't know yet. But something has shifted. The case, long frozen, has cracked. The word solved is not spoken, not even whispered, but possible returns to the conversation for the first time in 34 years. A familiar name rises to the surface, one that appeared early and then sank without a trace. A name that fit too easily into the background back then. A name that had never been fully examined because there was no way to prove what everyone only felt. The detective drives past the old house, now quiet, ordinary, unaware. He imagines the night again. The unlocked door. The silence. The phone call. He imagines a person confident enough to leave no obvious trace, confident enough to speak into a machine and believe the message would die there. He imagines that confidence eroding, slowly, as decades pass and technology catches up. In a different part of the state, a man wakes up every morning believing he got away with it. He has a family, a job, a routine. He has told himself the story so many times it feels true. There was no proof. There was never any proof. The past stayed buried. Until now. The evidence locker closes with a metallic click. The box is no longer sealed. The tape spins once more, its sound filling a small room with a voice from another era, a voice that thought it was safe. Outside, Illinois moves on, unaware that a cold case from 1989 has begun to breathe again, that the silence is thinning, that a suspect's name, long forgotten, is about to be spoken out loud. The morning after the body was found, Illinois woke up uneasy, like a town holding its breath without knowing why, and the name of the victim began to circulate in clipped sentences, whispered across kitchen tables and spoken into telephones with cords stretched tight, because once a name replaces the word body, fear stops being abstract and starts walking beside you. The apartment where it happened was still sealed, yellow tape snapping in the cold wind, officers standing stiff with coffee going untouched in their hands, staring at a door that now felt heavier than it should have been, because inside that small space-time had collapsed, leaving behind a violence that refused to explain itself. Detectives moved through the room slowly, deliberately, as if the walls might speak if they listened hard enough, photographing every angle, every shadow, every object that looked out of place or painfully ordinary. A chair pushed back just slightly too far from the table. A glass in the sink with a faint lipstick mark. A clock stopped at a time no one could yet agree mattered. These were the fragments of a life interrupted, and already the question was spreading faster than any official statement. Who could have done this, and why here and why now? The victim's routine became the first map investigators tried to follow, tracing days backward like footprints in snow, hoping they would lead to a face instead of fading. Friends described habits with confidence that only comes after the fact, saying she always locked the door, always took the same route home, always trusted the same people. Co-workers recalled small details that suddenly felt loaded, a tense phone call, a distracted look, a comment about feeling watched that no one took seriously at the time. Neighbors offered what they had, a door slamming late at night, footsteps on the stairs, a car idling longer than usual. None of it lined up cleanly, but all of it fed the same growing sense that someone knew her well enough to get close enough to avoid a struggle, close enough to turn familiarity into a weapon. The crime scene itself refused to cooperate with simple narratives. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered locks or splintered frames, just a door that had been opened and closed like any other night. The violence was precise, controlled, suggesting anger but also intention, the kind that doesn't erupt randomly but waits, plans, and executes. Forensic teams collected fibers, fingerprints, biological traces that technology of the time could barely promise to interpret, carefully bagging evidence with a quiet hope that science would someday catch up to their need for answers. In 1989, that hope was fragile, built more on faith than certainty, and detectives knew it. They documented everything anyway, because this was the job, to preserve the truth even if it couldn't yet be read. As word spread, the community's shock hardened into something sharper. Parents walked their children to school. Doors were locked earlier. Conversations drifted back to the same questions, over and over, like a scratched record. Was it a stranger? Was it someone from work? Was it someone she trusted? Rumors bloomed in the absence of facts, pointing fingers at ex-partners, acquaintances, anyone whose name could be said with a hint of suspicion. Detectives chased those rumors down long hallways of interviews, knocking on doors, sitting across from people whose faces tightened at the word murder. Alibis were offered, sometimes confidently, sometimes with the subtle cracks that make investigators lean forward and ask the same question again, just to see if the answer changes. Early suspects emerged quickly, as they always do, shaped by proximity and emotion rather than evidence. An ex-boyfriend whose temper was well known. A co-worker who had been seen arguing with her weeks before. A neighbor who lived close enough to hear things and perhaps hide them. Each one was pulled into the harsh light of scrutiny, questioned, cross-checked, their movements reconstructed hour by hour. But each time, the case slipped through fingers that were starting to ache from grasping at shadows. Alibielt. Timelines broke apart under verification. What looked promising at first glance dissolved into coincidence or misunderstanding, leaving detectives staring at their notes, frustrated by how quickly certainty had evaporated. The investigation pressed on, fueled by pressure from above and grief from below. The victim's family demanded answers with a quiet dignity that only deepened the weight of every failure. They sat through interviews, repeated stories, handed over photographs and letters, anything that might help paint a clearer picture of who she was and who might have wanted her dead. Detectives listened, took notes, and walked out carrying more than just files. They carried the expectation that justice was not optional. And yet, days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the case began to show the first signs of cooling, the initial flood of leads narrowing into a trickle that could no longer sustain momentum. Evidence that once felt urgent settled into boxes, labeled and stored, waiting for a breakthrough that never quite arrived. The biological samples were preserved as best as possible, though no one could promise they would ever speak. Technology lagged behind the questions it was being asked to answer, and detectives knew that some truths were trapped in that gap. They revisited the scene in their minds, replayed witness statements, argued over theories late into the night, voices rising and falling as frustration bled into obsession. Was it personal or opportunistic? Planned or impulsive? Someone passing through or someone who never really left? Every theory fit some facts and contradicted others, leaving no clean line to follow. As the months dragged on, the community's attention began to shift, pulled away by new headlines, new fears, new tragedies. But for those closest to the case, time did not dull the edges, it sharpened them. Detectives returned to old interviews, listening for hesitations they might have missed, rereading reports for patterns that only emerge after repetition. They walked the neighborhood again, this time in daylight, then at night, trying to feel what the victim might have felt, to see what she might have seen. Still, the silence held. The person responsible had either vanished or learned how to blend perfectly into the background, leaving nothing behind but the echo of violence and a question that refused to settle. By the end of the first year, the case was no longer front-page news. It had become something heavier, more insidious, a cold case in the making, though no one wanted to say the words out loud. Files thickened. Evidence aged. Detectives rotated off to new assignments, carrying the memory of this one like a bruise that never quite healed. The family marked holidays with an absence that could not be filled, anniversaries that reopened wounds instead of closing them. And somewhere unknown and unnamed, the person who had done this continued living, moving through the same world, untouched by the questions that haunted everyone else. The investigation never officially stopped, but it slowed to a crawl, sustained by stubbornness rather than hope. Each new tip was evaluated, each call returned, Each rumor checked, even as the likelihood of resolution seemed to slip further into the past. The evidence locker became a kind of time capsule, holding fragments of a night that refused to stay buried, waiting for a future that might finally know how to listen. And as the years passed, the case hardened into legend, spoken of in the same breath as other unsolved crimes, a reminder that not all stories end where they should, and that some truths can remain hidden not because they are impossible to find, but because the moment to see them has not yet arrived. The rain comes down thin and cold, turning the streets of central Illinois into black glass, reflecting patrol lights that pulse red and blue against brick storefronts and darkened windows, and somewhere inside that rain-soaked grid a memory stirs that never fully went quiet, a memory that belongs to 1989, when the town still smelled like corn dust and diesel and Friday nights meant football lights cutting through the dark. When the murder first happened and nobody knew yet that it would refuse to stay buried because now, decades later, the case is no longer just a rumor or a faded headline, it is a wound reopened, and the investigation moves again, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the careful, almost reverent steps of people who know they are walking across fragile ground. Back then, the police file grew thick fast and then stopped growing at all, stacked with witness statements that contradicted each other, timelines that never aligned, tips that burned bright and died within hours, and photographs that showed a life abruptly interrupted, frozen in grainy color, taped to corkboards in a room that smelled of old coffee and dust. The detectives were younger then, or different men entirely, working with rotary phones and handwritten notes, knocking on doors late at night, trying to read truth in the flicker of porch lights and nervous eyes, convinced that the answer had to be close, because violence like that didn't feel random, not here, not in a place where everyone recognized everyone else's truck. But time did what it always does. It eroded certainty. Witnesses moved away, or forgot, or learned to live with what they had seen by burying it under routine. Evidence went into boxes, boxes went onto shelves, shelves filled with other cases, and the murder slipped into that category that law enforcement hates the most, the one they rarely say out loud, the cold case, a phrase that sounds clinical but carries a quiet admission of failure. Years passed. The town changed. Stores closed. New families moved in who had never heard the story, and those who had learned to lower their voices when it came up, as if speaking too loudly might invite it back. What breaks the stillness is not a confession or a dramatic arrest but paperwork, a review mandated by policy, a cold case unit going line by line through old files with fresh eyes, scanning documents into computers, digitizing photographs, relabeling evidence bags with modern barcodes, and somewhere in that process, something small but stubborn refuses to stay insignificant. A name appears more than once where it shouldn't. A timestamp feels wrong. A piece of evidence logged but never tested sits quietly in a box marked with fading ink. It isn't a revelation yet. It's a discomfort. The kind that makes an investigator stop scrolling, lean back, and stare at the ceiling for a long moment. They start pulling threads. Not fast. Carefully. The victim's last known movements are laid out again, minute by minute, mapped onto streets that still exist but feel different now. A gas station that once had a single pump and a flickering sign is now a chain store with bright LEDs and surveillance cameras on every corner. A bar where someone claimed to have seen the victim arguing with a man no longer exists at all, replaced by a parking lot. The past doesn't fit neatly into the present, but the present has tools the past never did, and those tools start to hum. Old interviews are reread, not for what they say, but for how they say it. Hésitation. Changes in phrasing. The way certain people were eager to talk while others were strangely precise. A family friend's name surfaces again, a person who had been around the victim often enough to be invisible, close enough to be trusted, someone who had answered questions years ago and walked away uncharged, their statement filed and forgotten. Back then, there had been no physical evidence to anchor suspicion, no clear motive that could survive scrutiny, and in a small town, accusing the wrong person could tear everything apart. Now, technology changes the balance. Forensic testing that didn't exist in 1989 is routine today, and evidence once considered useless suddenly carries potential weight. A piece of fabric. A trace of biological material so small it was barely documented. The chain of custody is checked and rechecked, because time is ruthless, and any mistake could render the discovery meaningless. When the lab results come back, they don't scream guilt. They whisper possibility. A partial profile. Inconclusive, but not empty. Enough to justify going further. The detectives track down people who haven't thought about the case in decades. Some are surprised anyone still cares. Others are visibly shaken, as if the knock on the door has dragged something out from a place they worked hard to seal off. Memories surface in fragments, uncertain but emotionally charged. Someone recalls a strange phone call. Someone else remembers a car parked where it shouldn't have been. None of it is definitive, but together it forms a pattern that leans, subtly but unmistakably, in one direction. The family friend is older now, hair thinner, posture different, life shaped by years of ordinary choices. When investigators reach out, it's framed as routine, a follow-up, just a few questions to help close the file. The conversation is calm, polite. But something shifts as it goes on, a defensiveness that wasn't there before, a correction offered too quickly, a detail volunteered without being asked. The interview is recorded. Every word preserved. Every pause catalogued. No one raises their voice. No one needs to. Behind the scenes, the case accelerates. Records are subpoenaed. Old employment histories are examined. Movements that once seemed unremarkable are recontextualized. The timeline tightens, squeezing out excuses that once fit comfortably. Investigators cross-reference everything, building a structure of circumstantial evidence strong enough to support a deeper probe. This isn't about proving guilt yet. It's about seeing whether the story still stands when the pressure increases. The community begins to sense something, the way small towns always do. Rumors move faster than official statements. A patrol car seen outside a familiar house. A conversation overheard at the diner. The old name spoken again, cautiously, with disbelief. For some, it feels impossible. For others, it feels overdue. The idea that the truth might have been sitting in plain sight all along is unsettling, because it forces people to question not just one person, but an entire shared history. As investigators prepare their next steps, they're acutely aware of what's at stake. A wrong move could collapse the case. A right one could finally bring clarity to a death that has haunted this place for 34 years. The evidence is still fragile. The narrative incomplete. But the direction is clear now, and there is no turning back. The past has been invited into the present, and it isn't leaving quietly. The night before a critical meeting, one detective reviews the file again, alone in an office lit by a single desk lamp, flipping through scanned images of handwritten notes, photographs of streets that look almost identical to the ones outside the window, and statements signed by people who trusted that the system would figure it out eventually. The weight of that trust settles heavy, because tomorrow could change everything, not just for the suspect, but for the family who has lived with unanswered questions for most of their lives. Outside, the rain stops, leaving the streets slick and reflective, mirrors that hold both past and present at once, and somewhere in that quiet, the case waits, no longer frozen, no longer dormant, but not yet resolved, balanced on the edge between suspicion and proof, between memory and fact, as the Illinois 1989 cold case moves closer to an answer that has taken more than 3 decades to reach this point. The night refuses to let go, even decades later, because what happened next is the kind of detail that lodges itself in the back of a town's throat and never dissolves, the kind of moment that turns an ordinary Midwestern street into a headline that refuses to fade, because by the time investigators step back into the house for the second full forensic sweep, something feels wrong in a way that can't be measured, can't be photographed, can't be logged into an evidence report, and yet every seasoned detective in the room feels it, that quiet pressure behind the eyes, that sense that the truth has been standing in front of them for years wearing the wrong face. The house smells of old dust and stale varnish, the crime scene tape long gone, the neighbors watching from behind curtains as officers move in slow, deliberate arcs through rooms that have been scrubbed of life, because the family couldn't live here anymore, because every corner carried an echo of that night in 1989 when the phone rang and rang and rang unanswered, when a back door stood open in the cold, when a life slipped out of the town without explanation. They start with the living room again, measuring angles of entry, tracing imagined footsteps across the floor, recreating movements that no one witnessed but everyone speculated about, and it becomes immediately clear that the original investigation, rushed by pressure and fear and a need for reassurance, had settled too quickly on a story that made people comfortable. A burglary gone wrong. A stranger passing through. A faceless threat that came from outside and left no roots behind. It was easy to believe, easy to accept, because the alternative meant the danger had been close, familiar, woven into everyday routines. Now, under the harsh white glare of portable lights, the furniture looks smaller, the space tighter, and the idea of an unknown intruder moving freely through the house without being noticed begins to feel less convincing, like a theory that only works on paper, not in 3 dimensions. They move into the kitchen, where faint discolorations still mark places that were once cleaned aggressively, too aggressively, the kind of cleaning that happens when panic overtakes reason, when someone wants a mess to disappear without fully understanding what that mess represents. New forensic techniques allow technicians to coax meaning out of what looks like nothing, and the results start coming back in quiet conversations, in raised eyebrows, in pauses that last just a little too long. The pattern of movement doesn't align with a hurried break-in. The angles don't suggest chaos. They suggest familiarity. Someone who knew where things were. Someone who knew which floorboards creaked and which doors could be opened silently. Outside, the town has changed, strip malls replacing old storefronts, kids who once rode bikes now driving their own children to school, but the case reopens like a wound that never healed properly, and suddenly people remember details they'd buried, conversations they dismissed as gossip, moments that seemed insignificant until viewed through the lens of time. A neighbor recalls seeing a familiar car idling longer than necessary that night, headlights off, engine running low, but back then it was just another vehicle on a quiet street, nothing to report. Another remembers a voice raised in anger earlier that week, a domestic argument that spilled briefly into the open before retreating behind closed doors, dismissed as none of their business. Investigators begin pulling old witness statements, reading between lines written in a different era, when certain questions weren't asked loudly, when assumptions filled gaps that evidence should have occupied. They notice inconsistencies that were once overlooked, timelines that were never fully reconciled, alibis that rested on trust rather than verification. One name appears repeatedly, not as a suspect, not as a person of interest, but as a presence, a constant, someone who was always nearby, always helpful, always available when tragedy struck. At the time, that familiarity had worked in their favor. Now it raises the hairs on the back of seasoned necks. They bring that person in for a new interview, decades after the fact, and the room feels heavier than the years suggest, the walls absorbing every breath, every hesitation. The voice that answers questions is calm, practiced, almost rehearsed, telling the same story that's been told for over 30 years, a story polished smooth by repetition. But memory doesn't age evenly, and when investigators gently push, when they ask the same question in different ways, the cracks begin to show. Details shift. Timings blur. Small contradictions emerge, the kind that might be chalked up to fading memory if they didn't align so neatly with newly uncovered evidence. Outside that room, forensic reports stack up, each one adding weight to a growing realization that the case wasn't cold because it lacked clues, but because the clues pointed somewhere uncomfortable. A partial print, once deemed unusable, now finds a match in updated databases. Trace fibers, overlooked in an era before advanced analysis, tell a story of contact that shouldn't have happened, of proximity that can't be explained by chance. The narrative of a random crime begins to collapse under the quiet pressure of science. The town starts to feel it before anything is announced officially. Whispers ripple through diners and barbershops. Old friends avoid eye contact. Families revisit memories with a new edge, wondering how well they truly knew the people around them. The idea that justice might arrive this late doesn't bring relief so much as unease, because it forces a reckoning not just with a crime, but with the choices made afterward, the silence maintained, the comfort found in believing a lie. Investigators revisit the timeline again, this time anchoring it not to assumptions but to physical reality. Phone records, once scattered and incomplete, are reconstructed. Travel times are recalculated. Weather reports are consulted, revealing conditions that would have made certain movements impossible, others more likely. The window of opportunity narrows, focusing attention on a span of minutes that changes everything. Within that window, only a handful of people could have been present, and among them, one stands out with unsettling clarity. When they confront that person with the accumulating evidence, the air in the room shifts. The calm falters. The rehearsed answers stumble. A pause stretches too long, filled with the sound of a clock ticking, each second amplifying the weight of what's being implied. The denial remains, firm and absolute, but it's no longer convincing, not when science speaks with such quiet authority, not when the story no longer fits the shape of the facts. Outside, families of the victim wait, caught between hope and dread, because reopening a cold case means reopening old grief, and the promise of answers carries the risk of disappointment. They've lived with questions for decades, built lives around absence, learned to navigate anniversaries and holidays with an empty space that never quite closes. Now they're being asked to stand at the edge of that space again, to look down and trust that this time, there might be something at the bottom. The investigation presses forward, methodical, relentless, stripping away layers of assumption until only the core remains. It becomes clear that the original failure wasn't one of effort, but of perspective, a reflection of an era that preferred simple explanations to complex truths. The case didn't freeze because it lacked heat. It froze because no one wanted to feel the burn. As the days pass, the town braces itself, sensing that a line is about to be crossed, that a name long spoken with familiarity might soon be spoken with shock. The evidence locker yields one more forgotten item, a piece that had been catalogued and shelved without ceremony, now re-examined under new light, and the result is undeniable, a final thread that ties the entire pattern together. It's the kind of moment detectives live for and dread simultaneously, because it means the hunt is nearly over, and the answer, when it comes, will change everything. In the quiet hours before dawn, as reports are finalized and warrants prepared, the weight of 34 years presses down on everyone involved. This is no longer just about solving a case. It's about rewriting a history that a community thought it understood, about confronting the reality that the truth can hide in plain sight, patient and unyielding, waiting for the moment when technology, persistence, and courage finally align. And as the sun rises over Illinois, casting long shadows across streets that once seemed so ordinary, the cold case edges closer to its breaking point, carrying with it the promise of justice and the certainty that nothing will ever feel quite the same again. The silence breaks not with a confession, not with a siren, but with paperwork. Yellowed forms pulled from a metal drawer that hasn't been opened in decades.
Illinois, 1989.
The year sits heavy, like a stain that never washed out. A time when phone cords curled like snakes across kitchen counters, when police reports were typed, not tapped, and when mistakes, small ones, quiet ones, had a way of becoming permanent. The detectives standing under flickering fluorescent lights don't know yet that what they're holding will redraw everything they thought they knew. They only know the case number. They only know the words stamped in red across the folder, cold case. Back then, the town tried to move on. It had to. Factories still opened their gates at dawn. High school football games still filled the bleachers on Friday nights. But one house remained dark. One family never quite came back to normal. The murder had torn through the community like a sudden storm, violent, brief, unforgettable. Everyone remembered where they were when they heard. Everyone remembered the rumors. Everyone remembered the name. And then, slowly, the noise faded. Leads dried up. Witnesses stopped returning calls. The case slipped from the front page to the archives, from urgency to obligation, from obsession to regret. What resurfaces now is not dramatic at first glance. No blood.
No weapon.
No shocking revelation scrawled in ink. Just inconsistencies. A witness statement that doesn't line up with a timestamp. A logbook entry written out of sequence. An evidence tag that lists an item as processed, but never explains how. The kind of details that mean nothing, until suddenly they mean everything. The detectives read in silence, the room filled only with the soft rasp of paper sliding against paper. Each page adds weight. Each line tightens the knot. In 1989, investigators had worked fast. Too fast, some would later say. The pressure was enormous. A community demanding answers. A family demanding justice. Local media circling like vultures, counting the days since the body was found. Tips poured in. Names were floated. Alibis checked and rechecked. And somewhere in that chaos, a decision was made. A suspect was questioned, then quietly dismissed. Not cleared. Just set aside. The file notes are vague. Language careful. No definitive reason given. Just a sense of relief, as if everyone was grateful to move on. But now the relief feels suspicious. The detectives trace the timeline again, hour by hour, minute by minute. They reconstruct the night as if it's happening in real time. The victim leaving work. The drive home. The stretch of road where the streetlights thin out. The neighbors who heard something but couldn't quite place it. The call that came in too late. The first officer on scene, noting details that would later disappear from summaries. And there, sitting in the margins, is the name. The same name, repeated more often than memory allows. A family acquaintance. Trusted.
Familiar.
Someone who knew routines. Someone who wouldn't raise alarms by simply being there. In the original investigation, that familiarity was treated as comfort. Now it reads like opportunity. The detectives notice what wasn't tested. Evidence collected but never sent to a lab. Samples preserved but never analyzed. In 1989, the technology wasn't there, or at least that was the excuse. DNA testing existed, but it was expensive, slow, uncertain. Departments had to choose what was worth the effort. Many cases lost that gamble. This one among them. The box was sealed, labeled, and shelved. Decades passed. Dust accumulated. Lives changed. People aged. Some died. The case waited. When the evidence locker was reopened, no one expected miracles. Cold cases rarely deliver clean endings. More often, they deliver more questions. But as the seals were broken, something shifted. The air in the room felt heavier. The items inside were intact. Carefully preserved. Forgotten, but not destroyed. Fabric. Fingernail scrapings. A personal object that had always felt out of place. The detectives exchanged glances, unspoken agreement passing between them. This wasn't nothing. This was a second chance. The lab results didn't come back quickly. Weeks stretched into months. During that time, the detectives dug into the suspect's past.
The Family Franc.
The one who had faded into the background of the story. In 1989, he'd been cooperative. Polite. Helpful. He'd attended the funeral. Offered condolences. Provided an alibi that no one pushed too hard to verify. Now, decades later, that alibi looked thinner. Witnesses who could have confirmed it were gone. Timelines blurred. Small contradictions emerged. A shift change that didn't match. A receipt that placed him nearby, not miles away as claimed. Then the call came. The DNA profile pulled from the evidence didn't just speak, it shouted. A clear match. Not partial. Not speculative. A statistical certainty so overwhelming it left no room for doubt. The room went silent again, but this time the silence was different. Electric. Heavy with consequence. After 34 years, the case had a voice. And it was pointing directly at the man no one had wanted to look at too closely. News travels fast in small towns, even decades later. When word leaked that the cold case was being reopened, old wounds tore open. The victim's family was called in, asked to sit down, asked if they were ready to hear something they'd been waiting half a lifetime for. Shock doesn't begin to describe it. Relief collided with grief. Anger surged alongside disbelief. They'd trusted this person. Let him into their home. Shared meals. Shared holidays. And all along, the truth had been hiding in a sealed box on a shelf. The suspect was located living quietly, life reduced to routines and habits built over years of not being caught. He had a job. A family. A reputation that had survived intact. When detectives knocked on his door, the past came rushing back with brutal force. The interview room felt smaller this time.
The question sharpée.
The pauses longer. He denied everything at first, voice steady, eyes calm. But when confronted with the science, with the numbers, with the evidence that time could no longer protect him from, something flickered. Not remorse. Not fear.
Juste calculation. The arrest sans shockwave through the community.
Headlines screamed the words everyone thought they'd never read. Cold case solved.
34 years too late. Or maybe just in time. All neighbor talked again.
Stories resurfaced. People replayed memories, searching for signs they'd missed. Could they have known? Should they have known? The town held its breath as the legal process ground forward, slow and relentless, forcing everyone to relive what they'd buried. Yet even with the suspect identified, questions lingered. Why had he been dismissed in 1989? Who decided the evidence wasn't worth testing? Was it incompetence, or something darker? Files suggested no conspiracy, just exhaustion. Limited resources. Human error. The quiet danger of assuming the familiar is harmless. The case became a cautionary tale, not just of violence, but of oversight. Of how easily justice can slip through the cracks when urgency fades. As the courtroom dates approached, the weight of the years pressed down on everyone involved. Witnesses struggled to remember details. Memories conflicted. Defense attorneys pointed to the time gap, arguing contamination, coincidence, bad luck. But the DNA stood firm. Science didn't forget. It waited. patient,
unforgiving.
And now it demanded an answer. For the victim's family, closure came in fragments. A name.
À face.
An explanation that still didn't explain why. No verdict could return what was taken. No sentence could erase the decades of unanswered questions. But there was something in the knowing. Something in the fact that the silence had finally been broken by truth, not rumor. In Illinois, the year 1989 is no longer just a date on a file. It's a reminder that cold cases are not dead. They are sleeping, waiting for someone to care enough to wake them, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for the moment when forgotten evidence becomes the loudest voice in the room. And as the doors of the courtroom close, as the town exhales for the first time in years, one truth remains, echoing through every hallway and headline: time can hide a killer, but it can't save them forever. The phone lines have gone quiet now, not because the truth has been found, but because the city has learned how to live with the noise of unanswered questions. Illinois, late 1989, winter pressing its weight against brick apartments and shuttered storefronts, the kind of cold that sinks into concrete and stays there. The case file grows thicker, heavier, pages curling at the edges from too many hands flipping back and forth, searching for something they might have missed. Detectives sit under buzzing fluorescent lights, eyes red, coffee gone cold, replaying the same timeline until it no longer feels linear, only circular, looping back on itself like a bad dream that refuses to end. A cold case, the papers call it now, the words stamped like a verdict across headlines that once screamed and now barely whisper. The victim's name still echoes in certain neighborhoods, spoken carefully, almost respectfully, as if saying it too loudly might reopen the wound. Friends age. Parents grow older. The room where it happened is repainted, refurnished, rented out again. Life moves forward, indifferent, but the crime scene photos do not change. Blood patterns frozen in time. Furniture marked with yellow evidence tags that have long since been peeled away. The smell of disinfectant that never quite erased what happened there. Investigators know every inch of that room by heart. They can close their eyes and walk through it step by step, where the body was found, where the struggle began, where the silence finally settled. Tips still come in, though less frequently now. A man at a bus stop claims he saw something years ago. A woman calls late at night, her voice shaking, saying she heard a confession during an argument that ended in divorce. Each lead is logged, assessed, often dismissed.
Memory blur. Stories shift.
Time corrodes details until truth and imagination become nearly indistinguishable. Detectives learn to listen without believing, to hope without expecting.
This is the grain of a cold case. No dramatique, no cinématique, juste relentless, slow erosion.
Inside the evidence room, boxes sit stacked like forgotten coffins. Brown cardboard, black marker scrawled across the sides, case number, date, victim's name. One box, sealed tight, has not been opened in years. Inside it, items once considered too insignificant, too contaminated, too inconclusive to matter. Fibers that didn't match anything known at the time. A partial print smudged beyond recognition. Biological material collected before DNA analysis was more than a theory discussed in academic journals. Back then, it was stored away, catalogued, waiting for a future no one could quite imagine. Outside the station, the community's anger has cooled into resignation. Murals fade.
Candlelight vigil stop.
New crimes replace old ones in the evening news. But for the family, time does not heal, it only stretches the pain thinner, spreading it across decades until it becomes part of daily existence. Holidays arrive with an empty chair.
Birthday pass marked only by silence.
They learn to measure life not in years but in absences. Each knock on the door carries a brief, irrational hope that this time, finally, someone has answers. The original investigators are older now. Some retired. Some transferred. Some buried. The case is passed down like a curse to younger detectives who inherit boxes, transcripts, grainy photos, and a responsibility heavy enough to bend their shoulders. They read reports written before they joined the force, handwriting slanted, language dated, assumptions shaped by another era. They notice things their predecessors couldn't have known to look for. Patterns that only become visible after years of failure. Technology advances quietly, without fanfare. Databases expand. Methods refine. DNA, once a novelty, becomes routine, then revolutionary. Cold case units begin to form, staffed by detectives who specialize not in chasing suspects down alleys, but in chasing time itself. They reopen files others have written off, not because they expect miracles, but because sometimes persistence outlives probability. The Illinois case lands on one of their desks again. Not with urgency, not with optimism, but with a question: what if? What if something in those boxes could speak now? What if evidence dismissed in 1989 could finally be heard? A request is filed. Permissions granted. The evidence locker opens with a dull metallic sound, a door creaking as if protesting the disturbance. Dust rises. Gloves snap into place. Items are removed carefully, reverently, like relics. A swab is taken from preserved material. Another from a fabric scrap. Chain of custody forms are signed, dated, photocopied. The samples are sent to a lab where machines hum softly, indifferent to the weight of what they're about to reveal. Days pass. Weeks. No one talks about it openly. Experience has taught them not to. While the lab works, detectives revisit witnesses who swore they'd already told everything. Doors open reluctantly. Faces tighten at the mention of the victim's name. Some details change. Some remain stubbornly consistent. One name surfaces again, quietly, almost apologetically. A person who had been around back then. Close, but not too close. Helpful, but not overly so. Someone everyone trusted enough not to question too deeply. Back in 1989, that trust had been enough. Now, it feels like a mistake. Old alibis are examined under new light. Timelines reconstructed with modern precision. Phone records, once limited, are reconsidered. Employment logs rechecked. The suspect pool narrows not through drama, but through elimination, like pieces being slowly removed from a board until only one remains. Then the call comes from the lab. The kind of call detectives pretend not to wait for, but always do. A match. Not perfect, not cinematic, but statistically significant enough to stop the room. The numbers speak in probabilities, but the implication is unmistakable. Someone's DNA, preserved through decades of darkness and doubt, has finally found its voice. The name attached to it is familiar. Too familiar. A family friend. Someone who attended gatherings, shared meals, offered condolences when the body was barely cold. The realization hits not like a punch, but like a slow, nauseating drop. Memories rearrange themselves instantly. Gestures once read as kindness now feel rehearsed. Grief once shared now feels staged. Detectives sit in silence, absorbing what this means. Not just for the case, but for everyone involved. For the family who trusted the wrong person. For the investigators who didn't look hard enough. For a community that lived alongside the truth without ever seeing it. The suspect is still alive. Older. Slower. Living a life built on a foundation no one questioned. Surveillance begins quietly.
No sirens. No headlines.
Just observation. Movements logged. Patterns noted. The suspect senses something, perhaps, a shift in the air, an unease they can't explain. People who have lived with secrets for decades often develop an instinct for danger, even when they don't know its source. The case is no longer frozen. It is thawing, slowly, unpredictably. Each step forward threatens to collapse the fragile structure built over years of silence. Detectives know better than to rush. One mistake could undo everything. They move carefully, deliberately, aware that they are walking into a past that has already destroyed enough lives. As night falls over Illinois, the evidence locker door closes again, but this time it feels different. Not like an ending, but like a breath held just before impact. The city sleeps, unaware that a truth buried since 1989 is beginning to surface, molecule by molecule, memory by memory, preparing to shatter the illusion that some crimes can truly be forgotten. The year is no longer 1989, but the weight of it still presses down like a hand on the throat, because by now the case is old enough to drink, old enough to vote, old enough to have grown children of its own, and yet the evidence refuses to age quietly. It keeps resurfacing, whispering, insisting, dragging the present backward into a past that never learned how to stay buried. And inside a windowless room in an Illinois evidence facility, fluorescent lights hum over cardboard boxes stacked like forgotten coffins, each one marked in black ink with dates that mean nothing to anyone who walks by too fast, except to the few who know that one of these boxes contains the reason a killer slept peacefully for 34 years. The box is heavier than it should be. Not because of what's inside, but because of what it represents. Gloves crackle as they're pulled tight. Tape peels away with a sound like skin tearing. The lid opens. Inside, carefully bagged, are items that once lay scattered on a bedroom floor in 1989, collected in silence, catalogued with care, then locked away when the trail went cold. A belt. A torn shirt button. A cigarette but sealed in yellowing plastic. Fibers no one could place. Back then, these things were mute. Now they feel loud. Almost impatient.
The investigator doesn't speak.
He doesn't need to. He's thinking about how many times this box was moved, how many times it was logged, how many times it sat untouched while the world outside learned new ways to read the dead. He's thinking about the victim's mother, who stopped calling after the 10th year, not because she stopped caring, but because hope is expensive and she had already paid too much. He's thinking about how cold cases don't die. They hibernate. In 1989, the murder stunned a quiet Illinois town that liked to believe it was insulated from the kind of violence that filled big city headlines. The victim was young, known, ordinary in the way that makes loss feel personal to everyone at once. She had routines. She had a favorite gas station. She waved to neighbors. When she didn't show up for work, people noticed. When police found her, the town fractured. The crime scene had been processed by the book, but the book was thin back then. Fingerprints were taken, but none matched. Witnesses were questioned, but memories blurred. Suspects surfaced and dissolved. One man stood out briefly, a name scribbled in a notebook, then crossed out when nothing stuck. He was close to the family. Trusted. The kind of person who helped carry groceries, who showed up at barbecues, who knew which doors stuck and which windows didn't quite lock. He answered questions calmly. His alibi held just enough to keep him free. And so the case slid into that dangerous place where time becomes the killer's accomplice. Now, decades later, the evidence is speaking a new language. The cigarette butt is removed from its bag and handed to a lab technician who wasn't even alive when it was collected. DNA extraction is routine now. Mundane. A process refined by thousands of solved crimes.
The machinum.
Data appears on a screen. A profile emerges. Not a face, not a name, just a genetic echo. When the hit comes back, it doesn't scream. It clicks. A soft confirmation tone. The profile matches a man in the system for an unrelated offense years later. A man who moved counties. Changed jobs. A man who aged quietly, who attended weddings, who buried relatives, who lived the kind of life that makes neighbors say, "I never would have guessed." His name has been sitting in old case files for decades, half forgotten, underlined once and never circled again.
Detective leaning closer to the screen.
No one celebrates. They've learned better. DNA is powerful, but it's not a confession. It's a door. And doors can slam shut just as fast as they open. They pull the old files. Paper crackles. Notes written by hands long retired describe interviews that now read differently. Statements that once seemed harmless now feel rehearsed. A timeline that barely held together in 1989 suddenly shows stress fractures. The suspect said he left at 9. The victim's phone rang at 9:20. The neighbor heard a car at 9:15. Back then, these were loose ends. Now they're threads. Surveillance footage doesn't exist. Cell phones are a fantasy. But there are still people alive who remember that night, and memory, when shaken, can sometimes drop what it's been holding. Detectives knock on doors they've never knocked on before. They ask questions that were never asked the right way. Some witnesses cry. Some get angry. One says nothing at all, just stares at the floor like it might open and swallow him. The suspect is brought in for questioning. He's older now. Slower. His hair is thin. His confidence is not. He smiles when he sees the interview room, like someone returning to a place he never thought he'd visit again. He denies everything. He says the evidence is wrong. He says he's being targeted because it's easy. He says 34 years is too long for the truth to matter. The detectives let him talk. They've learned silence is heavier than accusation. They slide photographs across the table. Not crime scene photos at first. Just places. Streets. Houses. A backyard fence. His jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. They show him the cigarette butt. The lab report. The DNA match. The room changes temperature. He asks for a lawyer. That's not a confession, but it's not nothing. As the legal machine grinds forward, the town starts to hear whispers. A name surfaces. The same name some people remember hearing once, long ago, before it disappeared under newer headlines. Shock ripples outward. The suspect was known, trusted, invited into homes. The idea that he may have lived among them all this time feels like a second crime. For the victim's family, time collapses. The phone rings, and suddenly they're back in 1989, standing in a hallway that smells like coffee and bad news. They are told the case has moved forward. They are told about DNA. They are told a suspect has been identified. They are not told it will make the waiting hurt less. Court filings lay out the story in cold language. Genetic material recovered from the scene. A match probability so small it borders on impossible. Defense motions argue contamination, chain of custody, the unreliability of old evidence. Prosecutors respond with logs, signatures, photographs of seals intact after decades. The sealed evidence box becomes a character in the story, silent, stubborn, unimpressed by the passage of time. Reporters dig in.
Headline it like punch.
Cold case solved. Decades-old murder reopened. Suspect identified after 34 years. The town is tired of being famous for this, but it can't look away. And yet, even now, nothing feels finished. Because a solved cold case doesn't erase the years it spent unsolved. It doesn't give the victim her life back. It doesn't return the birthdays missed, the holidays that felt wrong, the empty chair that became part of the furniture. What it does is something quieter and more unsettling. It proves that the past was watching the whole time. In the evidence room, the box is closed again, but it's no longer forgotten. It's been catalogued into the present, its contents finally translated into a language the living can understand. The investigators leave the building under a gray Illinois sky, knowing that the case has crossed a line it can never uncross. Somewhere, the suspect sits alone, replaying a night he thought had faded into myth, realizing that memory isn't the only thing that remembers. Plastic remembers. Fibers remember. DNA remembers. And as the town settles into uneasy sleep, one truth hums beneath everything else, low and relentless, the kind that never stops once it starts. A cold case is never really cold, it's just waiting, patient as evidence in a box, for the moment when time finally runs out. The room is quieter now, not because the noise has faded, but because everyone has learned to hold their breath. Years of false starts have trained the detectives to distrust momentum. Yet something has shifted. A name sits on the table, no longer theoretical, no longer blurred by time, written in ink instead of pencil. The Illinois cold case that once lived in file drawers and whispered rumors is tightening, inch by inch, toward a human shape. Outside the station, winter presses its face against the glass. Inside, the air smells like old paper, burnt coffee, and the dull electricity of consequence. The evidence does not arrive with drama. It never does. It comes folded inside lab reports, time-stamped interviews, margins filled with small, precise language. A partial print re-examined under newer software aligns where it once slipped. Fibers dismissed as contamination now make sense when placed against a jacket no one thought to keep. A witness statement from 1989, shaky and inconsistent, is reread without the assumptions of that era. The voice on the page sounds different now. Less confused. More afraid. The words do not change, but their weight does. Cold case logic is not about new facts. It is about seeing old facts without the blindfold of urgency. The suspect's name surfaces quietly, carried by a chain of routine checks. He lived nearby then. He moved often after. He stayed just close enough to the margins of the investigation to feel familiar, just far enough to avoid scrutiny. In 1989, he was described as helpful, polite, the kind of neighbor who offered rides, the kind of man who smiled too easily when asked where he had been that night.
Back then, the town wanted the nightmare to be a stranger. A drifter. A shadow passing through.
Familiar faces felt safer. They still do. Detectives track his timeline the way archaeologists read soil layers. A job change here. A breakup there. A sudden move months after the murder, explained away as opportunity. Old addresses connect to old phone records. A bar receipt places him 2 blocks from the victim's last known location. Nothing explodes. Nothing screams. The picture sharpens slowly, like an image coming into focus through fog. Each confirmation adds pressure. Each contradiction tightens the circle. They knock on doors that haven't been opened to police in decades. Former coworkers, ex-partners, friends who drifted away. Some remember him vividly. Others remember the feeling he left behind. A discomfort they couldn't name. A temper that surfaced without warning. A story he told too often, as if rehearsed. People are older now. Their loyalties have softened. Regret makes them braver. The interviews stretch late into the night, voices cracking as memories return with the force of a delayed echo. One woman pauses before answering a question she has been asked before, long ago. She remembers the night differently now. Not because the facts changed, but because she understands fear better. She describes a call that came too late. A request she didn't take seriously. The detectives do not interrupt. They know this moment matters. Cold cases live and die in these pauses, in the space between what was said and what was meant. The suspect agrees to speak. He walks into the interview room with the confidence of someone who believes time has protected him. His hair is thinner. His hands shake slightly. He smiles anyway. The questions begin softly, circling familiar ground. Where were you living then? Who did you know? Do you remember the victim? He answers smoothly. He has had years to practice. But practice leaves grooves, and grooves can be traced. When the timeline tightens, his posture changes. When a detail is challenged, his voice sharpens. He laughs once, too loudly. The room does not laugh back. They present evidence carefully, not as an accusation but as an invitation to explain. The reanalyzed print. The fibers. The witness who remembered more than she thought. He watches their faces instead of the documents. He is calculating, not reading. That is the tell. When the conversation turns to the sealed evidence box, reopened after 34 years, the air shifts again. His smile falters. He asks how they found it. He does not ask what it contains. Another tell. Outside, the community senses movement before it understands it. Old headlines resurface online. The victim's name trends locally, then spreads. People who were children in 1989 read about the crime as adults, stunned by how close it was to their own lives. Parents remember locking doors earlier than usual. Teachers remember counseling sessions that followed. The case was never solved, but it was never forgotten. It lived under the town's skin, an itch no one could scratch. The victim's family is called in. They sit across from detectives who look different than the ones they met decades ago, but sound the same. Careful. Measured. Apologetic without saying sorry. The family listens as the pieces are laid out, not as promises but as progress. The name is spoken aloud for the first time in this context. A family friend. A familiar presence from the past. The shock lands unevenly, like a wave hitting stone. Anger follows grief. Then something quieter. Relief, edged with betrayal. Legal hurdles loom. Time has eroded more than memories. Some evidence is gone. Some witnesses are dead. The prosecution builds its case methodically, aware that the defense will lean heavily on delay. Why now? Why not then? The answer is simple and unsatisfying. Because now the truth has less to hide behind. Because technology listens better. Because people are finally ready to speak. The arrest does not come with sirens. It comes early quietly, in a parking lot outside a grocery store. The suspect does not resist. He looks smaller than he did in the interview room. Cameras capture the moment anyway. The headline writes itself. Illinois 1989 cold case solved. Suspect identified after 34 years. The words travel fast, but understanding lags behind. Solved does not mean healed. Identified does not mean explained. In court, the past is reconstructed with clinical precision. Photos projected onto screens. Diagrams drawn cleanly over old maps. The defense pokes at gaps, at faded memories, at the arrogance of certainty after so much time. The prosecution does not flinch. They let the evidence speak in its new, clearer voice. When the sealed box is opened on the record, the room holds its breath again. The contents are ordinary. A piece of clothing.
A small object.
Ordinary things become extraordinary when they survive long enough to tell the truth. The verdict does not erase the years. It rearranges them. The community exhales, not in celebration, but in release. Conversations change. The story gains an ending, even if it is not a comforting one. People visit the place where it happened, now unremarkable, and feel the weight lift slightly. Justice, delayed, arrives without ceremony. And yet, the cold case leaves its mark. It reminds everyone that time is not a shield. That silence is not the same as safety. That evidence waits, patient and unforgiving. In Illinois, in 1989, a life was taken and a town learned to live with the absence. Decades later, the truth surfaced not as a revelation, but as a reckoning. The echo fades, but it does not disappear. It settles into the collective memory, a warning written in solved files and reopened boxes, a reminder that some stories end only when they are finally told. The room where the cold case unit now works is quieter than the old squad rooms ever were, quieter than the precinct was in 1989, quieter even than the victim's street after midnight, and in that quiet the weight of 34 years presses down on every document spread across the table, every photograph curled at the edges, every cassette tape digitized and scrubbed of hiss but still carrying the tremor of voices that never imagined they would be heard again, and the investigation no longer. Feels like a hunt so much as an autopsy of time itself, layer after layer peeled back, not to relive the violence but to understand how it hid so well for so long, how it slipped through the cracks of an era when technology lagged behind brutality and certainty was often built on instinct instead of proof. And as the detectives work through the files, the sense grows that the case did not survive all these years because it was too complex, but because it was too ordinary, too easy to misread, too convenient to shelve once the headlines faded and the community learned to live with unanswered questions. They revisit the first suspect, the one who loomed large in the early weeks, the man whose name was whispered in bars and printed between cautious quotation marks, the man who fit the profile before anyone really knew what the profile should be, and in the light of modern analysis his shadow shrinks, alibis once dismissed as flimsy now supported by timestamps, by work logs, by witnesses whose memories align with documentary proof, and it becomes clear that suspicion in 1989 was a blunt instrument, swung hard and often, leaving dents but no clean breaks, and the case drifted because the investigators were chasing shapes instead of substance, impressions instead of evidence, narratives instead of facts. The files show how quickly momentum bled away, how leads were marked exhausted when they were merely inconvenient, how lab backlogs delayed results until urgency evaporated, how a single misfiled report sent an entire line of inquiry into a dead end, and as these details surface the story transforms from a mystery of who committed the crime into a question of how the system allowed it to remain unsolved. How a killer benefited not from brilliance, but from the slow grind of bureaucracy and the limits of the time, and this realization doesn't absolve anyone, but it sharpens the tragedy, adding a new layer of loss to a life already stolen. Then comes the turning point, not dramatic, not cinematic, but devastating in its simplicity, a routine audit of old evidence boxes prompted by a grant application, a line item on a spreadsheet, a requirement to catalog everything before funding could be approved, and in a dusty storage room a detective opens a box that has not been opened since the early 90s, sealed, labeled, forgotten. And inside are items that should have been examined more thoroughly, items that once held potential but were sidelined by limitations that no longer apply, and among them is the piece that shifts everything, biological material preserved just well enough to survive decades, silent, patient, waiting for a science that did not yet exist. When the lab report comes back, the language is clinical, restrained, but the implications are seismic, a profile extracted, partial at first, then refined, then run through databases that did not exist when the victim's family first stood in front of microphones begging for answers, and the result is not a name, not yet, but a direction. A narrowing of possibilities so sharp it feels like the walls are closing in on a truth that has been hiding in plain sight, and the detectives feel it, that low hum of inevitability that signals a case is waking up after a long sleep. They build carefully now, methodically, aware that every step will be scrutinized, that memories have aged, that witnesses have died, that mistakes made now cannot be blamed on the past, and they cross-reference the new genetic data with old timelines, with vehicle records, with employment histories, with movements once considered irrelevant, and a pattern begins to form, faint at first, then undeniable, pointing not to a stranger lurking in the dark, but to someone embedded in the victims. World, someone whose proximity once made them invisible, whose familiarity acted as camouflage, allowing them to pass through suspicion untouched. The name emerges slowly, reluctantly, spoken first in private, then written in reports with careful phrasing, a person known to the family, trusted, present in the margins of the original investigation but never centered, and as this realization sinks in, the emotional temperature of the case changes, the shock no longer abstract but deeply personal, because betrayal cuts deeper than randomness, and the idea that the answer was always nearby, smiling, offering condolences, sharing memories, becomes almost unbearable. Detectives revisit old interviews with this new lens, hearing pauses that once seemed insignificant now heavy with meaning, noticing deflections, rehearsed phrases, an eagerness to help that borders on performance, and while none of it proves guilt on its own, together it forms a mosaic that aligns disturbingly well with the forensic evidence, and the case, once a scatter of unrelated fragments, now feels coherent, grimly logical, as if the truth has been patiently arranging itself while everyone else looked away. They approach the family with caution, knowing that reopening the wound will hurt, knowing that revealing a suspect so close to home will shatter whatever fragile peace they have built, and the conversation is quiet, raw, marked by disbelief and a slow dawning horror, because solving a cold case does not restore what was lost, it only changes the shape of the grief, replacing the ache of not knowing with the sharper pain of knowing too much. And the family's reaction becomes another burden the detectives carry, a reminder that justice, even delayed, is never gentle. As the investigation tightens, the suspect's life is laid bare, decades examined through the lens of a crime they believed buried, and there are no dramatic confessions, no sudden collapses under pressure, just a steady accumulation of facts, of inconsistencies, of evidence that refuses to be ignored, and when the arrest finally comes it is quiet, almost mundane, a door opened, hands placed behind a back, a name read aloud. And yet the impact reverberates far beyond that moment, through a community that long ago stopped expecting answers, through a system forced to confront its own failures, through a family standing at the intersection of relief and renewed grief. The case is called solved in headlines, but inside the narrative is more complicated, because resolution does not erase time, it does not rewind choices or undo damage, it only illuminates what was hidden, and as the detectives close their files they understand that this story is not just about a murder in 1989, it is about the cost of waiting, the price of imperfection, the fragile hope that even after decades, truth can still surface, not because it was loud, but because it was preserved. Patiently, in a box no one thought to open, waiting for a moment when the past and the present would finally collide, and in that collision the silence would finally break. The room where the boxes were opened smelled like dust and copier toner, a narrow evidence archive tucked beneath a courthouse stairwell, the kind of place where time doesn't move forward so much as it piles up, year after year, file after file, and when the seal finally cracked on the last container marked 1989, the sound was small, almost polite, a soft tear of paper tape, but the impact was anything but, because what lay inside was not just evidence, it was a frozen moment, a version of the truth that had been waiting longer than some of the detectives now standing there had been alive, and the air shifted as gloved hands lifted envelopes, logs, cassette tapes, a manila folder stamped with a name everyone in the room already knew, the victim's name, spoken so often it had lost its edges, until now. 34 years earlier, Illinois had been bracing for winter when the crime shattered the routine of a quiet town, a body discovered under circumstances that didn't make sense then and still didn't make sense decades later, the kind of murder that doesn't explode but seeps, infects, lingers, one that turns neighbors into witnesses and witnesses into suspects and suspects into shadows. And for years the file had been thick with maybes and almosts, with tips that went nowhere and interviews that circled back on themselves, the investigation grinding forward until it didn't, until the case slid into that bureaucratic purgatory where hope is catalogued and then forgotten. Now the boxes were open, and the past was breathing again, every document a pulse, every photograph a stare from another time, and among them was a report that had never been digitized, a lab note typed on yellowing paper, misfiled, overlooked, its significance invisible in an era before databases and DNA indices could talk to each other, before science learned how to make the dead speak in clearer sentences. And as the detective read it, slowly, carefully, the words rearranged the timeline. Everyone thought they understood, not by adding something new, but by revealing what had always been there, ignored. The report described a trace sample, small enough to dismiss in 1989, inconclusive by the standards of the day, collected from beneath the victim's fingernails, logged, tested, archived, and then buried beneath more urgent cases, and as the detective traced the line of the text, the room seemed to tighten, because that sample was now exactly the kind of thing modern forensic science could resurrect, amplify, compare. turn into a name, and the realization moved through the room without anyone speaking, a shared understanding that the case wasn't cold anymore, it was waking up. When the lab received the sample weeks later, technicians treated it like a relic, fragile, degraded, one mistake away from being lost forever, and as machines hummed and numbers flickered across screens, the past began to translate itself into data points, into alleles and markers that didn't care about alibis or rumors or who had been liked or disliked in town, and when the profile finally stabilized, when the sequence locked into place, it was run through systems that hadn't existed when the murder happened, databases built on decades of other crimes, other mistakes, other truths uncovered too late. The match didn't come back immediately, and for a moment the familiar frustration threatened to return, that old sense of almost, but then the secondary search lit up, a partial hit, not a conviction but a connection, a familial thread linking the unknown profile to someone already in the system, someone whose name sat in a different file, a different year, a different crime, and suddenly the investigation wasn't guessing anymore. It was following a trail written in biology. Detectives rebuilt the timeline from the ground up, stripping away assumptions that had calcified over decades, replaying the final hours of the victim's life with fresh eyes, noticing gaps that had once seemed insignificant, re-interviewing witnesses who were now elderly, voices thinner but memories sharper than expected, and again, one name surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. A man who had been adjacent to the case since the beginning, close enough to be questioned, distant enough to be cleared, a name that had never quite left the margins of the file. In 1989, he had been just another figure in the background, someone with access, with opportunity, but also with a story that fit well enough to move on from, and for years that story had been accepted, not because it was perfect, but because there was nothing concrete to contradict it, until now, until science dragged a contradiction into the light and refused to let it go. When investigators knocked on his door more than 3 decades later, the man who answered was older, slower, wrapped in the invisibility of time, and for a moment the weight of the years seemed to protect him, the assumption that whatever he had done or not done was too old to matter now, but the questions cut through that illusion quickly, precise, informed, anchored in details no one should have known unless they had been there. And as the interview stretched on, cracks appeared, small inconsistencies that multiplied under pressure, the kind that don't prove guilt on their own but align perfectly when viewed from the right angle. The arrest didn't come with flashing lights or a crowd, just paperwork, handcuffs, a quiet ride to a station that had been renovated twice since the murder, and yet the impact rippled outward instantly, news alerts lighting up phones across the town, headlines resurrecting a name that had haunted conversations for years, Illinois 1989 cold case solved, suspect identified after 34 years. Words that felt surreal even as they were read, because solved didn't mean healed, and identified didn't mean understood. For the victim's family, the call came late in the day, a detective's voice careful, practiced, heavy with the knowledge that no phrasing could soften what was being delivered, and as they listened, decades collapsed into a single moment, grief reopening alongside a cautious, fragile sense of validation, the confirmation that they hadn't imagined the wrongness of it all, that the unease they had carried wasn't paranoia but intuition. And yet even as relief flickered, it was tempered by the realization that justice delayed does not arrive whole. In court, the evidence spoke with a confidence it had never had before, DNA charts projected on screens, expert testimony translating science into certainty, the misfiled report finally taking its place at the center of the narrative, and as jurors watched, the story rearranged itself again, not as rumor or theory, but as a sequence of events anchored in proof, and the defendant sat silent. The weight of years pressing down, every missed chance, every ordinary day lived in the shadow of an act that had never truly stayed buried. Outside, the town reacted in fragments, shock braided with grim satisfaction, conversations reigniting in diners and living rooms, people recalibrating their memories, re-examining old interactions with the knowledge they carried now, the unsettling awareness that someone capable of that violence had moved among them for decades, aging alongside everyone else, untouched by consequences until the past finally caught up. The case closed on paper, stamped, signed, archived again, but differently this time, no longer a question mark but a conclusion, and yet the story refused to end cleanly, because cold cases never really do, they linger as reminders of what time can hide and what it can't, of how truth doesn't expire just because it's inconvenient, and as the evidence boxes were resealed, now lighter in one sense and heavier in another, the room seemed to exhale, a long-held breath released. Somewhere in that archive, among thousands of other files, there are more envelopes, more overlooked reports, more voices waiting for technology, for attention, for the right moment, and the Illinois case stands as both a warning and a promise, that no matter how many years pass, the past is patient, and it keeps its receipts, and when it finally speaks, it does so with a clarity that cuts through decades of silence, leaving behind not closure, not peace, but something colder and more enduring. The undeniable weight of the truth, and the echo of a question that will always follow cases like this. How many answers are still locked away, and how long will they wait before someone listens?